So guys, today we're going to be talking about chapter 6, and we're just going to be looking at the Americas in general. So kind of like what we've been doing in the course, we're just hopping around different parts of the world, and then we're going to cover a large chunk of history in that area. Start off, does anybody know what that's a picture of? Or what city?
And Rio in Brazil?
Yep, Rio de Janeiro, one of the southernmost cities in Brazil. I was gonna go there, but there was something going on, some kind of civil unrest or something when I was in Brazil. But still want to go back, still want to climb that mountain one of these days. It looks incredible. So I like how the book has various focus questions throughout, and I just think it's kind of a neat way to organize the unit thematically. So first question here is just, who are these people who live in the Americas? Where did they come from? And this is, they aren't like, when the Spanish arrived, they obviously weren't the first people there, and they encountered natives. And so let's talk about who these people are. So Native Americans are a part of that larger Indo-European people group that are just migrating out from Central Asia. And this would have been as early as 40,000 years ago. People crossed the Bering Straits. So if you ever look at a map of Alaska and the easternmost part of Russia, that's the Bering Strait. And during the Ice Age, and again we're talking tens of thousands of years ago, this was covered in ice, and you could actually walk from Asia to North America. And so, we've got to think about this in a broad timeline, that most people were nomadic, hunter-gatherers, and if buffalo or mammoths or any type of game that people were living and hunting and depending on, if those animals migrated over, then the people who made their living on those animals, who actually survived based on those, are going to migrate as well. And that's the simplest version of how humans came here, and how they were very well established, obviously, by the time the Europeans arrived. Yes, sir?
Do you have any information on sea levels being 400 feet lower 12 to 20,000 years ago?
Yeah, so in fact, I think I misspoke and said ice. Because of the Ice Age, the polar ice caps were so much larger, and Bering Strait was actually a land bridge. And it was a land bridge because, like you said, the ocean was just a lower.
400 feet.
Yeah, and so that's the concern with climate change is, with the global temperature rising, the ice caps are getting smaller, and when the ice caps get smaller, of course, then the ocean levels rise. So, we could be talking parts of Florida are underwater within our lifetimes. Hopefully not, but again, that's kind of the neat theory. And so, in fact, the little video I've got playing here is showing the Bering Strait and showing how when the sea levels were lower, people could walk over. So, very similar to other parts of the world when we were talking about these early river dynasties, early river civilizations, when people began to farm, they were able to settle down. And so when we talk about the Americas, we're going to be looking at some of the oldest civilizations in South, Central, and North America. So when the first human beings arrived in the Western Hemisphere, we don't know the exact date. So again, I'm going to say approximately 40,000 years ago. But since this predates written records, and we're still talking about these people as nomadic hunter-gatherers, we have to make some assumptions based on the data we have. The evidence that we have is, for one, there are numerous physical similarities between the earliest Americans and then those people who were living in Asia around the same time. So basically, fossilized humans from 40,000 years ago closely resemble fossilized humans in Asia. And so we can infer from that again, they're probably coming from Asia across that land bridge. And it's a process. It's not like this all happened exactly 40,000 years ago, because the sea levels didn't begin to rise until about 10,000 years ago. So for over a broad period of time, people were moving through. So when did the first civilizations begin? And once more, this is a matter of some conjecture. The oldest, at this time, the oldest discovered human habitation is in central Virginia, and it dates back about 15,000 years. So who are these people? Again, hunter-gatherers, moving because their food supplies are moving, and and different civilizations, different city-states began to emerge in different parts of the Western Hemisphere. And when we begin to look at some of the earliest ones, it makes sense because, for example, when we look at Teotihuacan or around the tropical, just absolutely ideal conditions in this part of Mexico, you could almost throw a seed out and it's going to grow. I mean, it's just so conducive to farming. The rainfall is so abundant. The soil is so nutrient that this is going to be the site of some of the first settlements. So really, where we have this habitation from 15,000 years ago in Virginia, it's just a random hut that we found. But where we start talking about cities, that's where we really have to look at Central America. So I wanted to show you just a few of these drawings from your book. And this one is a warrior raid. And I don't know exactly, I'm going to guess and say it's either Mayan or Aztec. But a lot of early civilizations in the Western Hemisphere practiced human sacrifice. The Mayans and the Aztecs were the most famous to do this, but really many people did. And I want to start with the origin of most Native American languages, particularly in Central and South America. It's a language called Olmec. And this culture, and we just call them the Olmecs after this language, and it's really called a root language or a mother language because so many words in native dialects in Central and South America date back to these people. Just like in English, we can trace back a lot of our words to Latin or to Greek or to Anglo-Saxon, Old English. A lot of words in Native American, once again, come from these people. So who were they? Well, we know that they had the technology to develop tools and that they made beautiful things and they made large monuments that are still, you can still go see them. Their largest population center is a place called Levante. And we know that if you go to Central America and you look at some of the oldest pyramids, and what I think is fascinating is that you'll find this pyramid structure in different places around the world. And I'm just going to infer from that that people associate the sun with divinity. That especially in this kind of default religious state called animism, where we ascribe personality or deity to things that we don't understand. And so that's why you get lots of people building structures that are very tall that have a religious significance, because people believe they want to get as close to the sun as possible because that's the deity to be worshipped. So the Olmec civilization was characterized by intensive agriculture, the carving of these ornaments, and even organized social classes. Skilled workers, most people were farmers, but there was even, and I would say this is the ancient origins of lacrosse, so if you're familiar with that game, the Olmecs really were the first to play this, and they even had courts devoted to what was just called stone ball or stick ball. Another group that was a contemporary of the Olmecs were the Zapotecs. And by contemporary, I just mean they existed at the same time that the Olmecs did. And their most famous site is an ancient city called Monte Alblan. I'm probably butchering that, Monte Alblan. The site contains a number of temples and pyramids. Now, most of these people, and imagine this city numbered 20,000 people. Most of these people lived on terraces cut into the side of the mountain. So they had a significant impact on the environment around them, that they had developed and cultivated hills into terraces to be able to support more farming. Now, we believe that the government was theocratic, meaning that there's a priestly class who claimed to speak for the gods and then interpreted the will of the gods for the people. But we also know, again, most people were farmers, or there were many skilled workers. Now, the first enormous city, the first metropolis really, in Mesoamerica was the city of Teotihuacan. And it's about 30 miles northeast of present-day Mexico City, which ironically, Mexico City is one of the largest cities in the world today. So Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities. For reference, it was bigger than London when the Europeans discovered the United States. So did they discover or did they find advanced civilizations? Now, Teotihuacan dates back to about the 3rd century BCE and flourished for nearly 1,000 years. And if you go to Teotihuacan, I mean, the ruins have been excavated. You can take a tour of this place. But people stopped living there around 800 of the Common Era. And so, why did this happen? Well, for one, if you go to the city today, the center of the city has numerous temples and palaces. The most prominent of these is the Pyramid of the Sun. In fact, they're kind of, I think kind of zooming out on that. Some of these large ziggurat structures, very similar to what we were talking about in Mesopotamia. We know they had extensive trade with the Olmecs, with the Zapotecs, with people of all different areas. So these folks were traveling. There were trade networks. These people were in communication with one another. Now, most of the city was built a combination of stone and stucco, a type of clay. And so most of the structures there were made of this. And many people dwelt in apartment compounds, in fact. And some of these apartments, and by apartment I mean huge apartments, some holding tens of thousands of people. So apartments the size of cities, really. And the Mayans have just always fascinated me. You know, a very interesting group that began to emerge in prominence around the first millennia BCE. And they did extensive trade in, is it cocoa? CACAO? I think that's cocoa. Anyway, certain trees, and one of the most valuable trade items is a stone called obsidian. And it's this really neat black volcanic glass, and it's very brittle. It's a precious stone, and it's made from volcanic eruptions. And so if you go to the site of a volcano, it's possible you could find some obsidian, but there was a great deal of trade in this. And so these cocoa beans are, of course, the source of chocolate. And people were drinking chocolate beverages thousands of years ago. So I love it. They loved it. But it was particularly expensive. And so very wealthy people could access it. In fact, it was so expensive that cocoa beans were used as a form of currency. And kind of like salt in the Roman Empire, was so expensive it was used as a form of currency. And they even developed a process to turn chocolate into a fermented drink. Now, I never would have thought of that, but apparently there is a chocolate liquor that can be made from cocoa beans. So the Mayan rulers were very powerful and were surrounded by a class of wealthy nobility. And it's very likely, this being an agrarian society, and most places being agrarian at this point in the world, that wealth was equated to land. This is a pre-capitalist world that really wealth meant land and dwellings and property. And so many of these nobles were also part of the priestly class, or scribes, meaning they could read and write. But the Mayans were incredibly wealthy. And that could just be evidenced by the amount of artwork and beautiful architecture that has come from these people. And they were so wealthy, in fact, that some of it did trickle down. There was a middle class, a thriving group of the rest of us that could earn a living and could live comfortably and could sometimes progress and develop careers. So most people, though, of course, were farmers. And there's this clear division of labor strictly along gender lines. Men are responsible for fighting and hunting, women for homemaking. And of course, like other civilizations we've talked about, this is not an exact rule. So noble women could sometimes rise to political power, rise to prominence in religious life even. So we once believed that the Mayans were entirely peaceful, this idyllic utopian race. But that's not entirely true. In fact, evidence has shown that the Mayans, while a common culture and language, didn't always get along. So just like how the Greeks spoke common culture, had common language and culture, but constantly fought amongst themselves, the Mayans were divided into city-states. And they weren't always a united people. So warfare was common. And these human sacrifices would often come from prisoners of war. And so this means that the style of fighting in Mesoamerica is very different. That it wasn't always focused on killing your opponent. It was preferable to capture them and to sacrifice them. Because the Mayan religion, well, is polytheistic. There are many deities, and they shared common characteristics, though distinct from deities of nearby cultures. The cities were built around a religious ceremonial core. At the center of each of these Mayan cities was a large pyramid, and then this would be topped by a shrine to the gods. Now, their religion was very dark. One of the main gods in the Aztec religion, for example, is a god named Quetzalcoatl, and he demanded human sacrifice. And the Aztecs and Mayans both believed that these gods who controlled the weather desired human blood, and if they didn't get that, there could be periods of drought or famine. So one of the aspects that makes the Mayans so advanced is they have a sophisticated writing system based on hieroglyphics, and there was a class of scribes who kept detailed records. Now, sadly, a lot of these records were actually destroyed by the Europeans when they invaded. So many of the Aztec records and Mayan records were in fact destroyed because the Europeans thought these people worshipped dark gods, and they feared them. And so they commonly burned books and scrolls. And so we've lost a lot of this, but of course a lot of it's been saved and been preserved. So why did the Mayans decline? Now, somewhere in the 8th or 9th century of the Common Era, the high point of Mayan civilization began to decline. So we don't know exactly why this is. Some of the reasons have been debated. One possibility is they overused the land. Crop rotation didn't come along till later, and so without crop rotation and with an abundantly growing population, you can eventually just exhaust the land, and the land cannot support farming anymore, and so these civilizations would have to pick up and move when famines would force them out. So that's one possibility. It's possible that incessant warfare led for, kind of forced many of the Mayans to leave, because any time a war is going to cause a large number of refugees. Could be internal revolts, could be any number of natural disasters. I tend to think it's overuse of the land, but and I think this, and I think the evidence supports this, because one, if you're going to have a rapidly growing population of tens of thousands, and again, you're going to grow the same crop in the same fields over and over again, and then multiply that by the amount of food you would need to feed tens of thousands. With the pressure increasing on farms to produce more food, they're just going to continue to do that more and more. They're going to plant more and more year after year after year, and then eventually, you just can't do that. You can't do that long term. There was also a drought that lasted several hundred years, coupled with the fact that there was a lot of overcultivation. And so these could be likely explanations, geographic, agricultural, and we also know when there's limited resources, that can lead to conflict. So these city-states were constantly going to war with one another to get food or to get resources, to get what they needed to survive. So many of these ancient Mayan cities were abandoned. And so, that's one of the cool reasons you can go and see these Mayan ruins, is because they're empty now. It's not quite like the city of Rome, where the city of Rome still has a population of millions. Some of these Mayan cities are just empty.
Wouldn't several hundred years of drought pretty much mess up even the United States today?
I mean, it could, yeah. Like, think even of the Dust Bowl, just a decade of severe drought in one of the most important food-producing regions. Now, granted, there were other parts of the country that were doing just fine, and so there was actually, the irony during the Dust Bowl is that there was too much food, and so farmers couldn't make a living because the price of food had gone down. But coupled with the Dust Bowl, there was just no way they could produce enough food to keep up with the lowering cost. And so farmers kind of did that to themselves by, at least in the United States, severely overcultivating to the point that the soil couldn't grow anything anymore. And so that's part of why the Dust Bowl happened. But you're absolutely right. I mean, that was a score of 7 to 10 years.
Yeah, versus 200.
And that caused a massive migration. I mean, to the fact that, Okie became a common term because people were leaving the state of Oklahoma to go to places like California or anywhere really. So you have, a severely declining population there. So yeah, I mean, I think environmental is probably the most likely answer for that. So the Aztecs, among the groups moving to the Valley of Mexico after the fall of Teotihuacan, were the Mexica. And according to legend, they came from, I'm going to try to pronounce this, Aztlan, or Aslan, which the modern pronunciation of that is Aztec. And this provided them, while they were less sophisticated than their neighbors, they were certainly successful in establishing alliances, and they became the dominant city-state in Mesoamerica. The kingdom they established was a confederation, really a loose alliance, that the Aztecs were the dominant power, and these other states, these other city-states would be tributaries, meaning they would have to pay a tithe. They would have to occasionally supply the Aztecs with warriors, with people for sacrifice, and the Aztecs dominated over these people. They were led by a monarch who was believed to be both a secular ruler and a god. And so, the people, when Cortez encountered Montezuma and the people believed that he was descended from the divine. So one interesting part of this is that the Aztecs weren't a strict dynasty, that it wasn't father to son, father to son. Monarchs did not obtain their position by any form of family succession. However, the successor was selected from within the royal family by a council of officials. Meanwhile, though, other positions in the government were inherited titles. So most of the Aztec people would have been commoners, indentured workers, and of course slaves. And so most indentured workers were people who had no land of their own and who contracted to work on the estates of wealthier people. It's not unlike renting property from someone. So they would rent the property for a farm. I grew up on a farm that my family rented. So I guess that would make us the equivalent of indentured laborers. And so they would contract to work on these nobles' estates. And so gender roles within the family were very strictly defined. Male children were trained for war. Female children were trained for domestic duties. Now, they also had a writing system. It was also based on hieroglyphics, that is, drawings that represent objects or concepts. Now, the Aztecs, like the other folks who were living at that time throughout Mesoamerica, lived in a polytheistic religion, meaning there was a pantheon of gods. In fact, scholars have identified more than 100 different deities in the Aztec belief system. Some of these were nature spirits, like the god of rain, Tlaloc, and some were patron deities, like the symbol of the Aztecs themselves, Huitzilopochtli. And a lot of the art coming from the Olmecs resembled that of the Aztecs. So the Aztecs really built and developed a lot of their culture and identity from the Olmecs. That is, art and sculpture, architecture are going to closely resemble how the Olmecs did things as well. They also believed these had a religious significance. So, for example, at the center of the capital city of Tenochtitlan was the sacred precinct. And this, in the center of the city, had the largest pyramid to their gods. So I just think that's cool that chocolate was such a big deal, because it's my favorite candy. But for them, it was a hard to come by luxury that only the wealthiest could afford. And so it was just seen as such a special thing that they just ascribed a real significance to it. And of course, we can't talk about the Mayans and Aztecs without talking about human sacrifice. So the drawing of blood at ritual ceremonies, like this stone relief shows, and what we're seeing here is a female noble, the wife of a king, passing a rope pierced with thorns along her tongue to allow the blood to come out. So this is one of the most famous Mayan temples, Tikal. And so if you go to Mexico, it's on the must-see list. I haven't seen it. I want to. And this is really cool. This is a disc made of basalt. It weighs, I mean, the picture doesn't do it justice. This thing weighs 26 tons. And it contains numerous hieroglyphics detailing the Aztec understanding of the cosmos, of the beginning and the end. So I just want to show you a map real quick so you can see where these people are. Here's Teotihuacan, this is the Yucatan Peninsula. The Aztecs here, the present-day Mexico City. Cortez landed in Veracruz, by the way. And many of these places are well preserved today. Now zoom in a little bit on the Mayans. We're looking at the Yucatan Peninsula here, and as you can see now, there are many different countries whose native inhabitants would have descended from these folks. Now, we're going to hop up to North America for just a little bit. Similar to the American Indian communities in Mesoamerica, there were also contemporary communities of natives in North America. And so in many ways, these communities had some common characteristics. But early peoples are so often, and we really are too, defined by our geography. So there's going to be significant differences in the way these people lived. And so I thought it was just a cool picture. This is some earthen mounds dating back to the Mississippian era. Some of the oldest Native Americans that dwelt in North America. So if you ever go to Ohio, there are tons of these mounds. They can be found around here as well, but it's just one of the common aspects of the oldest Native Americans in this region. So we also know they had farming communities. We know they had contact with one another. Mounds tend to be one of the kind of defining characteristics of these people. But then if you hop over to the west, we're looking at the Southwest, what is today the Southwest United States. Then you can go visit the Pueblos or the Anasazi, and you can see these ancient cliff dwellings. Maybe if you ever get to float the Grand Canyon, and that's another on my bucket list, is you actually get to float by some of these cliff dwellings that people lived in very dry regions, mainly for safety. So this is one of these. This is Mesa Verde. It's hidden, well hidden, and that's purposeful so that they wouldn't be discovered by enemies. And again, well preserved because it's a very dry region.
Is that a river right in front of it?
I believe so. Let's hop back real quick. It's possible.
It looks like there's foaming water below those trees on the brown bank.
I've heard of Mesa Verde. I have not been there. Yeah, so it's another one on the list. But I know there are some of those cliff dwellings if you float the Grand Canyon. So I'm hoping to do that when my son gets a little older. But yeah, it's something I want to see.
How old is your son now?
He's 3.5.
Oh.
So he's old enough that I can do, I can get away for a weekend, but I hate to leave my family for too long. So, he's out of diapers, but um, eventually I'll get to take him with me on a lot of these trips. But now, South America is just, again, an incredibly beautiful place. Chile is probably one of the biggest adventure destinations that I'd like to visit. Explore some of the jungle and explore the mountains. But South America is really a continent with vast extremes in climate and geography. So much of the north is dominated by the Amazon River, dense rainforests. Of course, the largest rainforest in the world is in the northern part of South America. But further in the south, these dense rainforests begin to be replaced by more prairies and mountains. So it's not too dissimilar to the United States in that we live in the Appalachian region with abundant amounts of rainfall, and then as you go further west, you get into more prairies and a drier climate, and then you hit another mountain range. And so South America is not too different from that in that regard. But people have been living in South America for over 12,000 years. And there's evidence even that there are farming settlements in the Andes Mountains, one of the tallest mountain ranges in the whole Western Hemisphere, that people were living up there as early as 2000 BCE. So one of the most famous sites of these ancient South American dwellings is a place called Caral. And it's about 14 miles from the coast. Contains the remnants of a 4,500-year-old city, and sat on the crest of a 60-foot high pyramid. It's neat that a lot of traditional South American dishes really date back thousands of years. For example, staple food among the Caral are squash, beans, tomatoes. How many traditional South American dishes have that as a base? Rice and beans is served at just about every meal in Brazil, for example. So this culture reached its height during the first millennia BCE, and with the emergence of the Chauvin style. And the next people I'd like to talk about are the Moche. The Moche civilization appeared in northern Peru in the Moche River Valley. It occupied an area of more than 2,500 square miles, and its capital city was large enough to host 10,000 people. There were two massive pyramids made of adobe, each nearly 100 feet high. The larger of the two is now called the Pyramid of the Sun. 15 acres. 15 acres. It's a huge structure. Now, these Moche artifacts exhibit a real high quality of artisanship, and a lot of their artifacts indicate that these people fought with other city-states all the time. That warfare was a constant part of their lives. And one theory, perhaps, to explain this, and that's Machu Picchu, by the way, is that much of the land around Peru is very dry. And so resources were more scarce. And to compensate for this, places like Machu Picchu developed sophisticated irrigation systems that would maximize the use of the limited amounts of water. But by the 8th century of the Common Era, the Moche civilization was declining. So the next two people I want to talk about are the Wari and the Shimur. The Wari began to expand from their home in the Andes foothills and established communities. They spread and occupied many of the urban sites in the Moche Valley. The Shimor emerged, their capital city called Chanchan at the mouth of the Moche River. Chanchan was built mainly out of adobe. It housed 30,000 people in an area more than 12 square miles. And this included a number of palace compounds, surrounded by walls nearly 30 feet high. Now, these early civilizations in the Andes were not isolated from other societies at all. As early as 2000 BCE, local people had been venturing into the Pacific Ocean on wind-powered rafts. Transportation by land was more difficult, and this hampered the development of regular contact with distant societies in the Americas, and as well as the exchange of goods and ideas that helped the rise of civilizations from China to Rome. Now, the Inca began as a small community in the area of the Cusco. The city was located at an altitude of 10,000 feet in the mountains of southern Peru. In the 1440s, their powerful leader, Pachacuti, launched a campaign to conquer the entire region. He expanded his empire until the boundaries of the empire extended as far as Ecuador and central Chile and the edge of the Amazon basin. Pachacuti created a highly centralized state. With stunning concern for mathematical precision, he divided his empire into provinces and districts. Each province contained about 10,000 residents and was ruled by a governor related to the royal family. As populations grew, residents were moved to other locations. Even the capital was divided into 4 quarters, known as areas. Each area was governed by a strict social status and a set of economic functions. The entire state was built on forced labor. Often, entire communities were moved to work on massive projects. Pachacuti also constructed 24,000 miles of highway and roads that extended for more than 3,000 miles from the border of Colombia to a point south of modern-day Santiago, Chile. Trained runners carried messages from one station to another, and this would allow information to travel up to 140 miles a day. Many of these roads are still in use. So the state was built on war. Draft was a common part of life. Conscription amassed approximately 200,000 men for the Inca army. Now, the Inca had no writing system. They kept records using a series of knotted strings. These are called quipu. These were maintained professionally, and they kept numerical data for the state and record keeping. Now, east of the Andes Mountains in South America, other American societies were beginning to make the transition to agriculture. The most prominent of these were the Arawak, a people living among the Orinoco River in modern-day Venezuela. And having begun to cultivate manioc, that's a tuber or a root-based vegetable, also known as cassava or yucca, is the source of tapioca. And so they began to grow this along the banks of the river. And they gradually migrated down to the coast and then proceeded to move eastward along the northeastern coast of the continent. So eventually new people from South America began to migrate to the islands of the Caribbean Sea. Known as Caribs, they were more warlike than their predecessors and often drove away people who were already established in these places. So men and women in these societies were considered to have equal status. While there was a separation of roles, those roles were considered complementary and were often viewed as a divine division of labor. In these classes, women in these stateless societies were actually given greater respect than the other places we've been talking about. So I want to show you just a few works of Inca culture. So this was the founding deity of the Moche people, in what is today Peru. And of course, the famous site we all recognize, Machu Picchu. It's high in the Andes Mountains in Peru, and this is considered one of the most glorious or beautiful cities of Inca civilization. Again, if you go to South America, you got to see it. Now, just a recap here of the people we've been talking about and where they are.